Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you here in this room this afternoon, and also to those people watching online, to another of this year's Cambridge Climate Lecture Series. If watching online, please send in any questions during the lecture for the question and answer session at the end of the talk. Either tweet with the hashtag CCLS2019 or on the Facebook videos comment section. The lecture series was set up 2 years ago now in memory of Sir David Mackay, in order to raise public engagement on the topic of climate change and to facilitate some of the difficult conversations that come with this. This year's theme is climate change. Can we fix it? We went for this theme because conversation around climate change has moved past the point of debating its existence. Instead, we now wonder whether there really is anything viable that can be done to reverse or halt the trends that we are already seeing. It's very appropriate today, then, that we have one of the world's greatest climate change communicators, Katharine Hayhoe. She's Canadian, an atmospheric scientist and professor of political science at Texas Tech University, where she is director of the Climate Science Center. She has authored more than 120 peer-reviewed publications, and her TED Talk from last November, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has had over 1.5 million views. So let's talk about it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that excellent introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It is an honor to end out this session with so many diverse topics, all related to this issue of climate change. The topic of my talk is the 3 choices that confront us when we talk about a changing climate. But before we get to our choices, I want to begin with a perspective that takes us into the past. Since the beginning of natural philosophy, as we called it then, and science as we call it now, we have typically viewed the Earth as this vast, immutable firmament. It is so big, it seemed to us, hundreds and even thousands of years ago, that we humans couldn't affect it. And this is very relevant because this is a lot of what we hear today. Today, a much more accurate perspective on the world, I think, is this one, which is a photograph of the world at night. Those are literal lights of cities that you can see and the highways that connect them. Today, at night, we can see the influence that humans have on our planet. In fact, you may already know this from history, we were aware of and concerned about the impacts that humans have had on our planet for hundreds of years. Back in the 1300s, the air quality in London was so poor, specifically due to burning charcoal and biofuels within the city limits, that King Edward actually legislated that when his queen was in residence at the Tower of London, you were not allowed to burn sea coal within the city limits on pain of death. That was the very first air quality legislation back in the early 1300s. Since then, we have learned that by burning, specifically coal, we produce so much soot and dust and small particles that it has actually led to global dimming. We have learned, in fact, that we can today mimic the impact of a volcanic eruption on our planet, and people are considering the option of actually deliberately geoengineering our planet, an idea that would have been unthinkable to early scientists. We know that nuclear tests are now being used to actually track the circulation of the atmosphere and the ocean because small trace amounts of a substance moves through our entire climate system, and we know exactly which parts were human-made. We also know that many early climate studies actually focused on the impacts of a nuclear winter and the disastrous effects that that would have on our ecosystems, our agriculture, and our civilization. We learned, back around when I was young, we learned that the chemicals in spray cans, in refrigerants, even in early Nike Air shoes, these chemicals were building up in the atmosphere, creating a hole in the ozone layer. And today, of course, we're very conscious of the fact that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, as well as through deforestation, land use change, and agriculture, we are creating massive emissions of heat-trapping gases that are heating the planet, and they're causing the oceans to become more acidic. So today, we know something that we did not know hundreds of years ago and thousands of years ago. And the most important thing we know is that we are the ones conducting this experiment with our planet, the only home that we have. We can't say that we don't know. We've actually known this for quite some time. If you go all the way back to the 1820s, Fourier, who you may have learned about in math or statistics or engineering classes, Fourier was the first person to actually recognize the fact that the Earth should be about 30 degrees Celsius cooler than it is. And there's a reason why it isn't, and that reason is this incredible atmosphere that surrounds our planet. By a few years later, John Tyndall was able to identify the specific gases that occur in trace amounts in the atmosphere. Don't worry, this is as far into the chemistry as we're going to get. The gases like water vapor, methane, and carbon dioxide. And interestingly, he was also able to link these gases to specifically the gas that was released through mining coal, which is methane. So in the 1850s, he understood that fossil fuel extraction was actually increasing levels of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. Now, at the same time, and this is a fascinating bit of history, at the same time, on the other side of the ocean, there was somebody who was Tyndall's opposite in every respect. Her name was Eunice Foote. This is not an official photograph of her. We're still trying to track it down. I actually know what her 7th grade niece, and we're working on tracking down a verified photo, but this is one suspect that we have of her photo. She was completely different from Tyndall because she was not a professional scientist. She did not have access to the training of the day. She did not work in a scientific lab. She was not the member of a scientific society. She was a women's rights advocate. Her husband was a judge in upstate New York. And she did science experiments as an amateur to find out about the world. So in 1856, she did an experiment where she put different gases in jars and put them out in the sun and measured how the temperature of the gases went up. And based on that, she concluded, and she actually wrote in her paper in 1856 that was presented to the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual conference, which I myself present at today. In that paper, she wrote, if CO2 levels were higher, the planet would be warmer. Now, she actually came to that conclusion slightly erroneously because when you put jars out in the sun, they're exposed to all different wavelengths of light, not just infrared. She lacked the instruments, the tools, and the training that Tyndall had, but she was the first person to actually speculate that CO2 was the thermostat of the planet. She did not present her paper herself. It was presented by Joseph Henry, who was the president of the association at that time. But the next year, she wrote a different paper on a different topic, and she read it herself. Isn't that amazing? That was happening in 1856. And then, of course, by the 1890s, Arrhenius, who was a Swedish chemist, he knew that we were producing carbon dioxide, the planet was heating up. So using the physics and chemistry that was known in the 1890s, he calculated by hand the very first climate model. By hand, it took him about 2 years, he calculated how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, if we looked at basically a higher versus a lower future scenario. That's what he looked at. And he found also that the Arctic would warm faster than the rest of the Earth. Now, this was not his actual research. He was a physical chemist. That's what he won the Nobel Prize for. This was the work he sort of did on the weekends. And I feel very sympathetic because I do climate modeling and climate analysis myself. So after the first year, around Christmas, I think that was when his wife packed up and left him. But now we have supercomputers, so we can get everything running. We can set it up. We can get it all going in the background. We can have dinner with our family and come back afterwards. And then, by the 1930s, Guy Callender, who was an engineer who, again, in his free time, decided to ride around the world, collect weather station data, add it all up, and see if the planet was warming, he wrote a paper in 1938, which is really, I love this paper because he basically says, you're not going to believe what I have to say, but I will show you that the planet is actually warming, and this is all the data that he had at that time, and the reason it's warming is because of us. Of course, now, if you look at the data we have today, we have much more data that shows that clearly the planet is warming. But we've known this for a really, really long time. We've known that trace gases in the atmosphere are the thermostat of the planet. We've known that by burning coal and gas and oil, we're producing more of these heat-trapping gases. That's the main reason why the planet is warming, and the most accurate picture of our planet is no longer a pristine, untouched globe with no sign of human presence on it. Today, the most accurate picture of our planet, I believe, is this. Our future is really in our hands, and that is the biggest insight that we have learned in our field over the last 100 years. You might say, okay, but well, what else do we know now? So why are there even climate scientists today? Couldn't you just kind of close the book about 100 years ago? Of course, there's many more things to study. One of the things that we know now is we can actually quantify exactly how much of the warming is human, how much is due to changes in energy from the sun, volcanoes, natural cycles, and other. We can quantify this to really understand that we are in the driver's seat when it comes to this change. And we can also determine that we really are sure. How do we know we're really sure? Well, one way we can do it is we can actually create simulated Earths using a climate model. This one is using the GISS model from NASA. You can create simulated Earths, and in those simulated Earths, you can look at what would happen if only land cover was changing, if only aerosols or little particles in the atmosphere were changing, if only heat-trapping gases from human activities were changing. You can put it all together, and you can match it to what's really occurring. Something else you can do, we did this a couple of years ago, we combed through all of the scientific literature, and we found 38 studies that have been published over the last 10 years. Now, of course, there's thousands of studies that have been published saying climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious. Thousands. But we found 38 studies that have been published over the last 10 years that said climate isn't changing, or if it is, it isn't humans, or if it is and it's humans, it isn't serious. And we, and when I say we, I really mean our lead author, a guy called Rasmus Benestad from Oslo. But we as a team, we recalculated every single one of those papers from scratch. And then put all the code online so people could actually do it themselves. Can you imagine doing that? 38 analysis redone from scratch. And you know what we found in every single one of them? Every single one of them we found at least one error. Sometimes it was a simple calculation error. More often it was the fact that they did not include something that should be included, or they made an assumption that was incorrect. In every single one, we found something that if that was corrected, it would bring their results entirely in line with the other thousands of papers that have been published over the last century and more. So we know today that we really are sure. What else do we know today? We know today that depending on our choices, and these are different scenarios of how much carbon we are going to produce globally, we are going to see different levels of change. And these scenarios are a lot more complex than what Arrhenius dealt with. He just simply looked at levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. We look at today at population, demographics, technology, all kinds of different things, including whether the world becomes more globalized or more individualized. There's a lot of social science that goes into these scenarios to try to understand what the world would really look like depending on which pathway we follow. And then we also know this. We know the fact that every time we see a new headline, and I just pulled a couple of new headlines from last year, from this year, and then one from today as well. Every new headline, it seems like, says that things are changing faster than we thought. A new NASA study from last year finds sea level rise is accelerating. Permafrost in the Arctic is thawing so fast, scientists are losing their equipment. That's a Canadian story. A colleague just texted me today and said, hey, our new study is out. We actually found that not only is heavy precipitation increasing in a warmer world, we've known that for quite a while, it's actually, the trend is increasing. So it's happening faster. And in fact, over the last decade, we've seen 7% more extreme rain events than we would expect. We also know that surprises are possible. Now, surprise is usually a good word. I don't know how you feel about surprise parties. I'm actually not a big fan of surprise parties. I don't like surprises as a scientist and as a person, and unfortunately we know that surprises are possible because we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with our planet. Today, CO2 levels are well over 410 actually parts per million, a level that last occurred millions of years ago. And if it continues to grow over the century, it would lead to levels we haven't experienced in tens of millions of years. Why is that relevant? Will the planet survive? Yes, the planet will survive. It's seen much more extreme conditions in the past. Will human civilization survive? That's the question. So when people say, as they do almost every day, it's been warmer before, the answer is, were there people before? Were there almost 8 million people? Were there $50 trillion worth of infrastructure? Was every arable acre of land around the globe divided up and assigned to someone? No. The reason why we care is because we have not lived through changes this fast. And then we know that there's these things called, as scientists we call them positive feedbacks, which is a terrible word to call it. So, imagine you hand in an assignment and you get positive feedback on your assignment. How would you feel? Feel pretty good, right? Positive feedback is a terrible word for something as bad as this. So what I call them is self-reinforcing feedbacks or cycles. What is an example of a self-reinforcing feedback? It's where the Arctic warms, the shiny white sea ice melts, it exposes dark ocean or dark land underneath, and that darker area absorbs more of the sun's energy, which means the Arctic warms even faster. That is a self-reinforcing or vicious cycle. That doesn't sound so good, does it? We know that we have more of these cycles within the Earth's climate system. And unfortunately, those of us who work with climate models know that the systematic tendency of these models to underestimate temperature change in the distant past suggests that we're more likely to rather than overestimate the amount of long-term future change. That is not good news. And then we also know this. I like to show you pictures of some of the people who I'm quoting so you know who they are. This is our first live person here. This is Naomi Oreskes. And she, with a number of colleagues, published an interesting paper about 5 years ago now, or 6 years ago, where they said skeptics of the reality and the significance of human-caused climate change have frequently accused climate scientists of being alarmists. Have you heard that word before? Yeah, I hear it a lot. If you haven't heard it, just follow my Twitter feed and you'll see it about once a day. So she did what any good scientist would do. She actually studied it. What they found, looking at projections that were done in the 90s and projections that were done in the 2000s, comparing them to observations to see what really happened, if we were alarmist, what would happen? The projections would be higher than what really happened, right? Would be exaggerating. What she found was the opposite. Available evidence suggests that scientists have been too conservative. In fact, this was kind of scary. They found that scientists are biased towards being overly cautious, where we define caution as erring on the side of less rather than more alarming predictions. We call this, they actually coined a syndrome called ESLD, erring on the side of least drama. So like the drama queen is the opposite, anti-drama. So these are some things we know now that we did not know 100 years ago. So then when you look at public opinion in the United States, and this shows public opinion by county, that's what all those little squares are. Anything that is blue is less than 50% of people saying yes to, do you think global warming is mostly caused by human activities? Anything that is orange is more than 50%. The darker the color, the greater the number in either direction. When we look at something like this, we think, well, how can people say I disagree when the science goes back to the 1800s? Now, you may be thinking, I'm sure only one person's actually thinking this. You may be thinking, oh, that's the US. Well, I don't have this broken out for every region in the UK, but I do have a UK-wide average. I will show it to you. This is a UK-wide average from the British Social Attitudes poll last year. Humans are primarily responsible. That's about 35%. Not so good either. I have the one for Canada where they actually did do it by writing, and trust me, Canada does not look any better either. So we often think, and this is a little cartoon from the global weirding videos that I have on YouTube. I have a little YouTube series called Global Weirding, not warming, weirding. And they're short videos that address common questions. And one of the most watched videos is, well, if they just knew the facts, surely they would change their minds, right? Because we just went through a lot of facts. One of the biggest advances, I think, that has happened in the last 10 years in the area of climate science is not in the physical sciences, but rather in the social sciences. What's the difference? The social sciences study us. Psychology, political science, sociology, how we as humans interact with information. And so in the last 10 years, we've learned a lot. And we've learned that the answer to this question is essentially no. If it's on a topic that is politically polarized. If people don't know much about black holes or dark matter, and you give them more information, more facts will help them. If you give them something that is very politically polarized, though, more facts actually sometimes even make it worse. So the updated science I was giving you on paleoclimate, on future projections and things like that, it comes from an assessment report that I co-authored a year and a half ago. It was officially released by the US administration. It's called the Climate Science Special Report. It's a massive summary of the state of the science, sort of like an IPCC report. It's over 500 pages, so not quite as long as Working Group 1, but it's pretty massive. So what I was showing you comes mostly from this. And when we released this a year ago, last American Thanksgiving, I got a call from a reporter who said, well, will this finally, he literally asked this question, will this finally change people's minds? I mean, it's the Trump administration. You just published a 500-page report telling them that climate is changing. Yes, humans are responsible and the impacts are serious. Surely this will change their minds. What do you think? I said, I don't think so. I said, if somebody is not on board already, or even if they're just disengaged and they feel like it doesn't matter, more information about ocean acidification or how much of a certain extreme event was due to humans is not what's going to change their minds. And in fact, a study by Dan Kahan, a professor at Yale, a couple of years before, had found that people who, with the highest degree of scientific literacy, were not most concerned, they were most polarized. In fact, he went on further and he found basically that the smarter we are, the better we are at cherry picking the information we need to support our pre-existing opinions. When he looked at the data, this is actually from a different sociologist. This is from Larry Hamilton at the University of New Hampshire. He asked people, do you think climate change is happening now caused mainly by human activities? And then he ranked their answers by two things. He ranked them, first of all, by level of education, and then he ranked them by how they identified politically. And if you're not familiar with US politics, Tea Party is kind of a term for very conservative to the right-hand side of Republican. So what he found, and this study was conducted about 3 years ago, I think, what he found was that as people became more educated, what happened? More separated, right? And then, this is education, but Dan Kahan, again, Dan looked at ability to do quantitative reasoning, that's what he calls science intelligence. And he found a very weak correlation with the probability of getting the correct response here. But then he took this data set and he divided this data set into two groups based on one thing. Not level of education, but that's what I'm talking about. The smarter we are, and we all do this about lots of different things, that's the thing. So if you're sitting there feeling really good about yourself, this is more of a warning sign. Because the smarter we are, the greater our tendency to cherry pick just the data we need to win the argument, to say I was already right. And that's why more facts are not going to make a difference. But here's the thing. This is the map I showed you before, right? This is the map saying, do you agree with the science? And this is the numbers for the UK. Do you agree humans are responsible? Focusing on the yellow one in the middle there. How do we respond? Now, in our response, I actually want to tell you a Cambridge-specific story because I think this is very relevant. So a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, I was invited to speak at something called the Starmus Festival. Has anybody ever heard of the Starmus Festival? I hadn't either. In fact, I thought it was one of those fake invitations that you get because it sounded too good to be true. It said things, about like Queen and U2 and Neil deGrasse Tyson and Buzz Aldrin, and I was like, oh, that's, Clearly, that's one of those fake invitations where they want you to pay $5,000 to attend the conference. So I was going to delete it, but I've learned, because I also got something a few years ago that I thought was fake too. That was, congratulations, you're on the Time 100 Most Influential People list. I thought that was fake and I deleted it. Turns out it wasn't fake. Thankfully, they sent me a few more emails, and when I actually got an email saying, are you coming to the dinner, I figured that was a bit different. So I've learned. So this time I actually Googled the Starmus Festival. I found out it was real. I found out it was like the most amazing science fest you could ever imagine. So I said, yes, I would love to speak at it, because who wouldn't? You go there and they have a panel with every living astronaut who's walked on the moon on the panel, and that's just one panel. Also at that conference, Stephen Hawking gave one of his last talks, which was incredible. So I was sitting there listening to him, and of course, as you know, he was a strong advocate for the need for action on climate change. He spoke very compellingly about the threat that it poses to us. But as I was sitting there in the front row listening to his talk and, nodding along as he mentioned climate change, he then said something that absolutely shocked me. He said, climate change might get so bad, talking about how do we respond, climate change might get so bad that we might have to terraform Mars. I thought to myself, I do not think so. If climate change, if we do not fix it soon, it will basically mean the end of civilization as we know it. We will have less hope of moving massive numbers of people to Mars today than we would in the Middle Ages. There is no way that you are moving huge parts of the world to Mars, not to mention the fact that it would be a very elitist solution, because who do you think is going to get to Mars? Jeff Bezos is going to be the first person. Probably Elon Musk will be number 2. So I was sitting there, not even being able to believe my ears. And I was still kind of stewing over it the next day, thinking, how could you possibly say this is a viable solution? There's no way that's going to happen in time. And at my session, I was backstage with the former Master of Trinity. Martin Rees is probably well known to many of you. He's well known to me because my undergraduate degree is in astrophysics, and so he is one of the greats that we learn from. I was sitting backstage with him before we went on together, and I said, can I just ask you something? Do you agree with Stephen Hawking when he said that we might have to terraform Mars to escape from climate change? And he looked at me, I'll never forget, he said, oh no, he said, fixing climate change is a dawdle in the park compared to terraforming Mars. So there you go, that's the wisdom from Trinity. I said, yeah, thank you, I completely agree. So terraforming Mars is not the answer. If we can't fix climate change, we don't have a hope of making another planet more habitable for us. Instead, these are our choices. And this comes from John Holdren, who was the science advisor for President Obama. He said, when it comes to climate change, we have 3 choices. Mitigation, which is what? Reducing carbon emissions. Adaptation, preparing for a very different future. And suffering, which is not a word you typically hear a scientist say. We are going to do some of each. It's not a case of arguing today over whether we're going to do mitigation or adaptation. The answer is yes. We are going to do some of each. The only question that we have today is what the mix will be, because the faster we reduce our carbon emissions, the less we have to prepare for a different future, and the less suffering there will be. So let's talk about each of these options. I want to talk about adaptation first, because there's something really interesting here with adaptation. I was also a lead author on the second U.S. National Climate Assessment, the second volume of the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment. And this one was released this past American Thanksgiving. It was actually released the day after Thanksgiving, which is known as Black Friday. It turned out to be very appropriate because this was a very black report. It was 1,600 pages telling us how climate change is no longer a distant issue. It's affecting every single person in every sector of the US. And here's the interesting thing. It found that people are already responding and adapting, even if they don't even want to call it climate change. People are already adapting, but not fast enough. Because even though the most accurate picture of the world today, again, is our planet in our hands, even though we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with our planet, when you look at the public opinion maps, you see something very interesting, and we see the same thing in the UK. I'm going to show you a series of these maps, but I'm going to bring you back to the same polling results we saw for the UK because we see the exact same pattern. When you ask people, do you think global warming is happening? So no, is it humans, is it not? Just do you think it's happening? Turns out this is pretty dark orange. Most people think it is. There's one county in Utah that's light blue. There's one in West Virginia, and then there's one right, to that side of Atlanta. That's it. Everywhere else is orange, which means more than 50% of people say yes. Then you say, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Well, it turns out it's all orange everywhere. Even the counties who don't think it's happening think so. That's a bit of the problem with public opinion polling. But you get the picture. Do you think global warming will harm future generations? Pretty much the same result. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? You get a little bit more blue, but it's still a lot darker than do you agree with the science? Do you think it will harm people in the United States? A little bit more blue, but still more orange than do you agree with the science? And then they asked one more question. Do you think it will harm you? This is the problem. It isn't that we don't think the science is real, it's that we don't think it matters to us. I mean, if you look at some of these parts of the country, you could go to the streets in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, and California, San Francisco. You could go on the streets and say, do you think climate change is real? Do you think it's humans? Do you think it's serious? Yes, yes, yes. Nobody thinks it affects us. Now, if you're curious about those few little orange places, I do have a few suspicions. So it turns out when you break down levels of concern in the United States by demographics, the most concerned people group in the United States are Hispanic Catholics. And I think that explains a lot of what you see in southern Texas, New Mexico, California. Now you might say, of course, because the Pope wrote this big thing called encyclical a few years ago where he talked all about climate change. But the people group in the whole United States that is least concerned about a changing climate is white Catholics. Actually beat out white evangelicals by 1 percentage point. And so that shows you it's not the Pope that makes the difference, and that's what I'm talking about tonight at 6 o'clock. I have a lecture over at St. John's at 6 o'clock, and I'm getting a lot more into that type of thing. But that was just to whet your appetite. Yes, totally different lecture. Over in Miami, they are raising the streets by 2 feet in South Miami because of the problem they have with sunny day flooding today. And then interestingly, those little counties up there are where there's a huge resistance against the oil pipeline led by the Native American communities in those areas. So I think there's some reasons for the few orange places that we see, but most of it is blue. And again, if we go back to the UK, this is what we're talking about down here, this blue one down here. It's just over 25%. So very, very similar numbers. Why is that? It's because when we talk about climate change or global warming and we ask people to give us a picture, and I actually did this. Out of curiosity, it cost like $90, but I just wanted to do it. I posted on a graphic design website where you get freelancers to give you book covers. I said, I'm writing a book about climate change. What would you give me for a cover? Guess what I got? I got about 100 versions of this. Sometimes it was just the ice without the polar bear. Sometimes it was just the polar bear without the ice. But just about every single one of them was something like this. And here's the thing. So I'm from Canada. I work with a lot of colleagues from Norway. You talk to Canadian scientists. You talk to Norwegian scientists, 2 countries that are famous for polar bears, right? Do you know how many people in a room this size have seen a polar bear in real life? Usually me and one other person. How many, just out of curiosity, how many? Okay, you, me, all right, you guys are actually more than the typical Canadian or Norwegian scientists. Okay, I think we have 5 of us. But if this is the #1 symbol of a changing climate, why would we care, right? Or if we see pictures of people who are affected, those pictures are usually of people who live very far away in low-lying islands in the South Pacific like Tuvalu or Kiribati, not places near where we live. So that's why I truly believe that one of the most dangerous myths that the largest number of us have bought into is not the myth that science is somehow optional, though that's a very dangerous myth. It's the myth that climate change is a distant issue, that it only affects future generations and people who live far away from us. Why? Because the action doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter to me. So that's why when I talk about climate change in Texas, which I do a lot, I start with this. This is a picture of where I live. That is pronounced Lubbock, not Lubbock. All my family calls it Lubbock. I'm like, no, that's the German one. This one's Lubbock. This is where we live, and it's very, very, very flat. It is so flat that you can drive down the highway, staying not just on the road, but in your own lane, looking in the rearview mirror. Why? Because where you were 5 seconds ago, 30 seconds ago, heck, even 5 minutes ago, where you were is a perfect predictor of where you'll be when the road is dead straight. I haven't tried it, but you could. But then just as you get to the top of that map, there is a giant curve in the road. I actually did take this photograph very carefully with one hand on the wheel. There is a giant curve on the road with a row of concrete grain silos on the curve. And if we're driving up the road looking in the rearview mirror when we get to this curve, we will end up somewhere we didn't plan to be. So I explain to people that planning for the future based on the past, planning for water supply, agriculture, energy demand, urban planning, health, even national security, planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. It works great when climate is stable, as it pretty much has been over the history of human civilization on this planet. But it does not work when climate is changing faster than any time over the course of human civilization. So this is where I start, to show people why it matters. And then I make it local. I talk about a hurricane that happened in the state where I live, and the fact that studies show that human-induced climate change made it probably 3.5 times more likely and increased the rainfall, which in some places was over 50 inches. 50 inches of rain. It increased it by about 38% compared to the same hurricane had happened 100 years ago. I talk about local impacts, like how our droughts are getting stronger, how our extreme events are getting more variable, about the impacts that's happening that other people have done looking at the economic impacts by county. I talk about adaptation that's already happening in the places where we live. The fact that there was a suburb of Houston that had already, before Hurricane Harvey came along, did you know that Hurricane Harvey was the third 500-year flood in some parts of Houston in 3 years? So they had already taken a municipal golf course and decided to turn it into a water catchment area. They had only completed the first phase when Harvey hit, and it already saved 150 homes. I love this quote. This is a retired NASA employee who's on the planning committee. He said, "It held the water like a champ." I love that. So showing people that this adaptation is already happening is really important. I work with water districts, helping them look at how climate change will affect evaporation from lakes and water demand. And you can do that here. Just looking, if you look at Cambridge and adaptation, the city council has a page talking about adaptation. There's a climate change adaptation plan for Cambridge, and then my favorite headline, I have to say, Cambridge could end up on the coast. These headlines bring it home. They're not about the polar bears. They're not about Tuvalu. They're about Cambridge. Yeah, I checked. It actually means this Cambridge, not Cambridge, Massachusetts. That one's already on the coast. It brings it home to something that matters. So what about mitigation? How do we talk about mitigation? Well, again, if you want to talk about mitigation, I live in the state that produces more carbon emissions than any other state in the United States. So you might say, well, how do you talk about mitigation in Texas? I want to show you a few more of those public opinion maps that I showed you before. This time they ask people about solutions. Do you support funding research into renewable energy? This is a pretty dark orange map. Sure, Texas is a little lighter, which is kind of odd considering that we have more wind energy than any other state in the country, but it's still, 75 to 80% as opposed to 90 to 95. That's not bad. Do you support tax rebates for people who purchase energy efficient vehicles or solar panels? Do you support, okay, now you might not understand, but TAX is one of the worst words in the United States. Do you support taxing fossil fuel companies while equally reducing other taxes? A bill is currently before Congress. It was introduced in November that by Republican and Democrat Congress people together. So a bill is being considered asking people this question. It turns out it has huge support across the country. So they might not even agree that climate is changing due to human activities, but they support taxing fossil fuel companies. Well, I'm okay with that, right? What if they want to do it for different reasons? That's totally fine. The important point is that we act. Here in the UK, this is a survey from last year. Here in the UK, last year, they found 71% of people want greater investment in renewable energy. 71% believe fossil fuel companies should help pay for damage caused by extreme weather events. 62% would like to have solar panels, even though only 7% have them. So we actually like a lot of the solutions. Isn't that interesting? So I love talking about specific solutions that are happening in the places where I live, like the fact that the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport is the first carbon-neutral airport in the United States and Canada. Surprising, isn't it? The city of Dallas is already, its operations are 100% carbon neutral. I didn't even know that one until I went to a talk by somebody at the city. There's things that are happening in really unexpected places, and I love talking about mitigation. This is the American Wind Energy Association. They talk about how much water you save, how many jobs you have, how much energy is produced for each state. These are some really encouraging statistics. Last year in Texas, 19.2% of the power on the Texas grid was produced by wind or solar energy already. This is an analysis actually by the University of Texas showing which types of power generation are most affordable. The light green is wind. This is today, at today's costs. The light purple is solar, and then the orange is natural gas. And if you had a price on carbon of $50 a ton, it would look like this. I'll just go back here. Isn't that amazing? This is just looking at the costs. It's been 5 years since renewable energy overtook fossil fuels as the most new installed energy that year. By 2016, we saw that renewables are starting to grow. We still see a lot more traditional biomass. We have 2.2% nuclear energy. We have a lot of hydro. In fact, in Canada, we call our power hydro. You get the hydro bill. I didn't even, when I moved to the States, I was like, well, where's the hydro bill? And I was asking the landlord, and he's like, the hydro bill? What are you talking about? There is no hydro bill here. But we're starting to see that our fuel mix is changing. In 2017, there was a lot of records broken. I like reading this report for the good news it has. It talked about how global sales of electric cars increased 58%. I was one of those cars in 2017. That's my car. When we bought it, we plugged it in outside the house for the first couple of weeks before we got the plug in the garage. Every single neighbor on our cul-de-sac who normally drove by in their big GMC Yukon, and you'd wave out the window without rolling down the window because you don't want to waste the AC. Every single neighbor, instead of just rolling on by and waving out the window, they stopped their car. And if we were outside, they would get out and they'd say, what is that? I'd say, it's a car. Does it have a steering wheel? Yeah, it does. Does it have a gas pedal? Where did you buy that? And so we could talk about it. My husband actually particularly loved talking about it. And then the next time we saw them, they'd roll down the window and they'd be like, I love your car. So we were able to have conversations about these things because we were talking about new technology. As of 2018, the cost of renewables is closing in on fossil fuels, even including storage, which is really important because I don't know if you've heard that the wind doesn't always blow. I get somebody telling me that every week. I'm like, don't you understand the sun doesn't shine at night? And I'm like, really? You don't think anybody's thought of that before? But storage is also decreasing significantly. Of course, you've seen headlines like this because every year there's a new headline with a new record of hours broken without coal, which is pretty cool. And I like talking about some of the advances that are being made. Scotland's going to host the first tidal energy testing facility. Entire campuses, Ball State University in the US is entirely geothermal. That's a picture of their campus. They're creating modular nuclear that you can actually truck around on the back of a truck so you can set up as many units as you want. In British Columbia, there's a company that's paired up with Climeworks from Switzerland to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into fuel. And then if you burn it, it releases the carbon back into the atmosphere, but it's carbon neutral, essentially, as long as you power the conversion with clean energy. So mitigation looks a little different than you might think. These are all pictures of mitigation. I like talking about what companies are doing around the world. Walmart's the richest company in the world. Apple's number 11 right now, I think. I like talking about what's happening in different countries around the world. Morocco still has the biggest solar farm in the world. The UK, I believe, has the biggest offshore wind. China, of course, has more wind and solar than any other country in the world. But I like talking about what mitigation looks like here, where people don't have energy, where there is no grid, there are no big power plants, there are not even any fossil fuels. This is the face of mitigation today. And that's why mitigation is not about deprivation, about loss. Mitigation can be about a better future. Because there's still one more word. We talked about mitigation, we talked about adaptation, but I want to end by reminding us of why this is so important. And that's because when you look at who is most impacted by a changing climate, it's the people who live in the places that produced the least amount of heat-trapping gases. And that is not fair. The intersection between climate vulnerability and poverty is undeniable. If you just look at the geographic pattern here of climate vulnerability, this is a map of where people live in poverty. This is a map of where people are hungry. This is a map of where people die from unsafe water, many of those children under the age of 5. You see the connection here. Whether we live on the Gulf Coast of the US, in India, in California, we're affected by the way climate change is loading the dice against us, making our naturally occurring weather events stronger, or in some cases more frequent. We're vulnerable to them. We're vulnerable to extreme flooding, whether we live in Bangladesh or Toronto. We're vulnerable to increased risk of drought and stronger droughts, whether we live in Syria or Texas. Wherever we are, climate change is like the hole in the bucket. So the bucket is a problem that we're trying to fix. We're trying to grow enough food to feed the world. We're trying to eradicate malaria. We're trying to fix poverty. We're trying to educate children, especially women and girls. We're trying to give people the lives that we have. But climate change is the hole in the bucket. We are not able to fix these issues if we leave climate change out of the picture. It is, as the US military calls it, a threat multiplier. It takes poverty, hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water, even political instability, injustice, inequity, and it exacerbates it, it makes it worse. This is what suffering looks like. And it's already happening around the world. So we have these 3 choices. We have to do them all. But the more we mitigate, the less we have to adapt and the less suffering that there will be. And this is why we care about a changing climate. So what can we do about it? We need to look ahead down the road. Take our eyes off the rearview mirror. Plan for a different future. And one of the most important things we can do is actually summarized in the last of these maps I'm going to show you. So you remember how I showed you this very dark blue map? Do you think climate change will affect you personally? This is not the darkest blue map. There's one more. You know what the darkest blue map was? Do you ever talk about it? That's the darkest blue map. So connect the dots here. What do we talk about? We talk about what we care about. So if we don't talk about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we make choices in our own lives? Why would we ask others to make choices to actually fix it? It all begins with a conversation today. So that was why when last summer TED is in the TED Talks, not TED. That's why last summer when TED said, well, do you want to do a talk on climate change? What would you like to talk about? I said, I want to talk about the most important thing we can do, which is talk about it. Kind of sounds a little redundant, right? But it is important because if we don't talk about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we act? Yes, time is running out on us. Yes, the window of opportunity is closing. Yes, every year, every gigaton of carbon matters. But we need to act. And in order to act, We have to care. In order to care, we have to talk about it. So I want to leave you with this final thought. What can you do? You can have a conversation. No matter who you are, no matter where you live, you are able to have a conversation. And that is the most powerful thing that we can do. Not a conversation necessarily about the details of the science, a conversation about why it matters to us in the places where we live, and what are some really amazing things that we can do to fix it that will actually make the world a better place in the end. Thank you.
Katharine, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why don't you come and take a seat and we'll have a conversation?
Yes.
Wow. We've been very lucky in our Cambridge Climate Lecture Series in having conversations, and the conversations have been in here and in nearby and also online. Yeah, you're right. So what response do you get when you ask people to talk about things? I mean, sometimes you try to talk about things with people and they just don't want to.
That's right. So I get into this a little bit in the TED Talk, so if you're interested, that's kind of part 2 to this. Often people say, well, I don't feel qualified to talk about it. And then people will say, well, it's just depressing to talk about it. And then people will say, I don't want to get into an argument with somebody about it. And I agree. I hate arguing with people. I really do. I don't want to be depressed. The science is depressing enough. And in terms of feeling qualified, the most important qualification is just being able to connect with somebody. Because you could overwhelm somebody with stats and figures and data and information, but that wouldn't be a conversation. That would be a brain dump that you then walk away from. So I think the most important qualification, I would say, is a willingness to respect the other person and to listen to them and to figure out what makes them tick. Because as I talk about in my TED Talk, where we want to begin a conversation on climate change is not where we most disagree. It's something that we already both agree on. Are we both birders? Do we both come from the same location? Do we both care about the same things? And then connect the dots to how climate change affects that, but then always talk about something positive that we can do about it.
So let's have some questions from the floor. Now, the roving microphone is... No, but just the online.
Online.
So the roving microphone is... Where's that roving microphone gone? Well, I will start with this one, which is...
It will come while you start, yes.
So there was one from the online, which came in. What impact do you feel Brexit will have on the fight against climate change?
So we are seeing an interesting phenomena around the world. Sometimes we feel like it's just happening in the places where we live, but we are seeing it in many places where we see the world changing so quickly that oftentimes we react with fear. And in fear, we withdraw. We want to become more isolationist. We just want to be with people like us. We want to withdraw from the rest of the world. We're seeing this in the United States. We're seeing this in Canada, where I'm from. We're seeing it in Brazil. We're definitely seeing it in the UK. There's that fear of the world is changing too fast, so let's just withdraw and be with people who seem more like us. That is the opposite of what has to happen, I think, to fix climate change. The exact opposite, because we all live on this planet. We all breathe the same air. We all share the same resources. We are so intimately interconnected already. We all have to fix this thing together. And that means that a brilliant idea might come from somebody in a different country. An incredibly elegant, simple solution might come from somebody working somewhere else. The idea that policies to break down trade barriers so we can move clean energy technologies across easier might come from collaborations between countries or even entire regions. So instead of setting up those walls like we're seeing happening today, drawing lines around my territory, to fix climate change, we really need to be doing exactly the opposite, which I think is what the Paris Climate Agreement embodied, with every single country in the world coming together and saying, we are all part of this planet, this is our home. We can't build walls around our country that go up to the stratosphere. It just doesn't work like that. So we have to figure out ways that we can work together, because in the bottom, and at the end, the bottom line is we all really do want the same things, which is a safe place to live, clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, food to eat, and a good life. Yes.
Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to hear you here. I have two questions that relate to, and I poked you on Twitter actually. I've written a book called Writing Wild, 25 Women Who Shaped the Way We Read the Natural World. It comes out next year. And I include you in a box about some of the work you do. So I have two questions that relate to that. The first is, you probably saw yesterday in the New York Times an article about parents listen to girls more often when people are talking about climate change. Their daughters make a really big impact. Do you know, in your opinion, why that is? Do you have any opinions on sort of gender-based discussions, why girls are a little more successful?
Well, there are many gender-based aspects to climate change, and that is one of them. So they did a study at the University, or at North Carolina State University this past year, where they looked at teaching children about climate change and then having children speak to their parents and then looking to see if their parents' opinions were changed by their kids. So North Carolina is a quite conservative part of the country, and what they found was fascinating. They found that children were able to affect and influence the opinions of their parents, which was fantastic, number one, but they also found that daughters had the biggest impact on conservative fathers, which was fascinating. So I think part of that is just the dynamics of, daddy's little girl, I think. But also part of that is the fact that, for example, if you look around the world, women and children are disproportionately affected by the impacts of a changing climate. Also, studies have shown that when we're talking about solutions to any big, difficult, wicked problem, as they call it, when we're talking about solutions, the more diverse voices we have at the table, both in terms of background, heritage, culture, and gender, the more diverse voices we have at the table, the more robust and all-encompassing solutions we can come up with. And then you have the fact that when you look at the climate strikes that are happening around the world, many, not all, but many of the leaders are young women as well, raising their voices for the future of this planet that they will inherit. So I think it's fascinating that we're starting to see this kind of come to the fore, and I find it encouraging because in my own field of earth science, by the time you get to the level I'm at, I'm a full professor, 9% of us are women, which is a stunning lack of diversity, I think, across our sector. But we're starting to see that change in all aspects of voices speaking up about climate change, and I welcome it because, again, we need that diversity. We need all voices, all people at the table to say, this is a problem, we need to fix it, and we need to work together to do so. Thank you.
Very good. Question at the back there.
Thanks for keeping up the hopeful tone throughout. It's really helpful. So I went to a conference on this last week, and everybody noticed a distinct lack of representation from South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and talking about, just the pictures you had with the people in the solar panels and the way countries are developing in a different direction. What's going on with getting everybody involved in the conversation, not just the US and Europe?
Yes. So this struck me the most when I went to the Paris Climate Conference. We scientists, many of us don't typically attend the big climate conferences because the scientific work is done ahead of time. But I went to the Paris conference as part of a team with a nonprofit that was providing scientific advice to countries who couldn't afford to bring their own scientists with them. So it was fascinating because we got to dig into a lot of the issues related to other countries. And going to Paris and actually seeing and listening to the representatives of every country around the world was really stunning because I had not even recognized myself, even given the fact that I do a lot of work in developing countries and I always emphasize the incredible injustice associated with the impacts. I had not even fully internalized myself the extent to which my viewpoint and our viewpoint that we have in the media discussing the impacts and the solutions in the UK, in the US, and Canada, and Western Europe is so focused on mitigation. All the arguments are about mitigation, all the discussion is about mitigation, all the efforts are rightly focused on mitigation since we are some of the biggest emitters in the world. But the vast majority of countries in Paris were there to say, we produce almost no carbon. We have not historically contributed to this problem. Yet we are suffering. The rains are delayed. When they come, they flood. Our coasts are sinking. Our sea level's rising. Cyclones are getting stronger. We are already suffering. What will you do? And to me, it was so heartbreaking to see that when I went back to where I live in Texas, where I talk with people every day who don't think climate is changing. It took me weeks before I was able to have a conversation again, because I just felt so overwhelmed. I was just about to grab somebody by their lapels and start shaking them and saying, how dare you sit there in your comfortable, smug life saying that no, climate isn't changing, it's just a natural cycle, because I don't think it's worth making any changes to stop people from suffering and even dying today. It took me weeks to get over that. But I had to, because again, we all have to do this together. So how do we help people? I think technology transfer is huge. I'm really encouraged by the fact that especially solar, wind to a lesser extent, is making inroads into places where people don't have access to energy because we need energy. I think integrating climate adaptation and resilience and mitigation into relief and development is essential. But it breaks my heart when you look at the fact that the Green Climate Fund, which came out of the Paris Agreement, the Green Climate Fund is massively underfunded. Even President Obama, who was one of the foremost proponents for climate action, only gave half of what he promised before he left office. And that's from one of the richest countries in the world. So this issue is not being addressed at all. And it's profoundly unfair and unjust, and I wish I had an answer for your question. So, thank you.
There was a moment in Bonn, it was set for COP23, which was held, it was in Fiji, but it was held in Bonn because it wasn't going to be in Fiji. And there was a moment when the Fijian delegates went and stood at the edge of a coal mine. And this huge, great big coal mine, and they're standing there in their ceremonial dress, just in silence, looking in at this coal mine, because they don't have them in Fiji. And it's quite moving when you actually see that.
Yes.
Right, we've got another question here.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk, but you just touched on this previously right now, but I have come across several people who are climate change deniers, and we start having a conversation about sustainability, and I often struggle to try to address the issue to try to reach them, because whatever I say, whether that's facts or what I've experienced, they just say, no, it's a myth, or no, those are not true. And do you have any advice for when we are having conversations with these kinds of people as to how to best effectively try to tell us how we feel?
I do, because I have those conversations almost every day, and they're tough. So what I would say is, first of all, the global weirding episode, if I just tell them the facts, they'll change their minds, right? That's the one you want to watch, because it specifically goes through how do you have conversations with people who, when you bring the scientific facts to the table, it just polarizes the discussion even further. But then I would say further that when you actually look at where people are at, the 6 Americas of global warming is a really helpful tool, because it shows that people are not just yes or no. We actually fall across a spectrum, and they start at people who are dismissive. People who are dismissive will dismiss every piece of evidence they're given. So my personal definition of someone who's dismissive is somebody who, if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone that says global warming is real and foot-high letters of flame appeared before them, they would dismiss it. But they're less than 10% of the population in the US. Less than 10%. There's dismissives here in the UK. I get them on Twitter all the time. But they're much less than 10%. And everybody else is doubtful or cautious or concerned. So with those people, the most effective thing to do, again, is to begin the conversation with something they care about and to emphasize practical, viable solutions. I want to give you an example of a conversation I had with somebody at church. An older man found out that I was a climate scientist after a couple of years, and he was not happy. In fact, he was pretty bothered that we went to the same church. So he accosted me after the service, and he said, I just found out that you study climate change. You know it's just the sun, don't you? And so I said, no, it's not the sun, because it's important to answer. In fact, if it were the sun, we'd be getting cooler right now. And I said, but did you know that we have 30,000 jobs in the wind and solar energy industry in Texas? And he looked at me and goes, well, it's just a conspiracy. Those scientists are faking the data. I said, no, they're not. And did you know that 20% of our energy came from wind and solar last year in Texas? And then he said, at that point he stopped and he said, why are you saying those things? And I said, well, do you have any problem with the fact that we've got 30,000 jobs, that, electricity from wind and solar creates 8 times more local jobs than natural gas, that Texas is leading the US in wind energy? Do you have a problem with that? He said, no, of course not. I said, well, those are the solutions to climate change. If we agree on the solutions, it doesn't matter if we agree on the science. So they looked at me and said, well, you know, Obama's birth certificate was faked. I said, we'll save that one for later.
Over here, yeah. It should be on, yeah.
Yes.
First of all, thanks very much for such an energetic talk. And I also want to thank you for highlighting the, I think it's the CCS facility in Squamish. How many more sites would you be able to put up that evidences the work that the traditional energy companies are doing to be part of the solution? There is a misconception sometimes that they're stuck in the past. Investors are increasingly saying if they don't move, and many of them are moving, they'll have assets that will be no longer of any value. So
That,
how many more
yes.
slides could you put up that evidences the traditional energy companies?
I like that. Thank you very much. I don't often get people suggesting new slides, but I'm going to make some new slides. I would add...
Please don't say you live in Texas and you're involved.
all right. I would add, the Rockefeller Fund divested from fossil fuels because, of course, they transitioned the world from whale energy to kerosene. Divested because they feel like that's what Rockefeller would do himself today. I would talk about the Texas Oil and Gas Company, who is actually powering their fracking with wind energy, which is interesting. There's a lot of advances happening with really interesting things like algae and biofuels. As a climate scientist, I'm very sensitive to the issue of the fact that the biggest part of my own carbon footprint comes from flying. So I'm actually here because I was giving a lecture tonight, and I like to do as many events in the same place as I can to minimize the carbon footprint of each event. So I really appreciate the advances that are happening in terms of transportation, flying, a lot of video conferencing and things like that. So if we're talking about solutions, I could probably go on a ways. But at the same time, it's very discouraging when a coal company in the US goes bankrupt and their emails are become public domain. A reporter combs through their emails and finds instructions from them to a legal organization to harass you and to call you all kinds of names and accuse you of crimes. It's very depressing when you hear big companies saying, oh, we support a price on carbon, and then you find out that they're still funding denial organizations that attack climate scientists. So there is absolutely good news, but at the same time, there's still a lot of bad news. And part of the reason for that is if you just go to Wikipedia, this is an interesting exercise, look at the list of the richest companies in the world on Wikipedia. Have you ever done that? I didn't do that until just a couple of years ago. On the list of richest companies, you have Walmart at the top, but then almost every single other company on that list made its fortune primarily from either extracting or processing or building things that burn fossil fuels. So we are talking about a massive shift in the balance of power and wealth in this world. It is not a small change that we are asking for. And so because of that, we can understand a bit of the struggle that's happening because there are many vested interests who want to keep us addicted, frankly, to fossil fuels as long as possible. And at the same time, just think about this, if we pulled the plug today on all fossil fuels, that would cause more suffering than climate change, at least over the short term. So it's an incredible tension between those two things.
So there are lots of good news stories going on.
Yes, there are.
And it's a trajectory towards where we need to go. Do you kind of see what that trajectory is? Do you have any kind of clarity in your mind? Or is it, well, gosh, we just don't know, but we've got to be moving in that direction? I mean, how do we know which things to do first?
That's a good question. So I feel that what we most lack right now is a vision of a better future. Because as scientists, we can present people with an increasingly detailed vision of the coming apocalypse. We can tell you now, to within a percentage point of what the crop yield reductions will look like, or the number of deaths from air pollution, or the, inches of sea level rise, with a proper uncertainty bounds on them, of course. So we can paint a vision of an apocalyptic future. And at the same time, we are presented with apocalyptic visions of what will happen if we do not have energy, if we wean ourselves off fossil fuels too quickly. This is painted for us regularly in North America of, the fact that the government will be telling you what to do, taking away your car, regulating how often you can shower. There's actually that really funny Miller and Armstrong cartoon from a number of years ago, the difference between climate and weather. And there's the Met Office has a little brochure. And if you dare say it's cold outside, where's global warming now? You're going to be in a cell. Have anybody seen that little sketch from? It's on YouTube from a few years ago from Miller and Armstrong. So we have these opposing visions of apocalyptic futures, but we don't have the vision of a better future. And I don't think that we scientists are the ones who can paint that. I think that for that we need others. And too often, I don't know if you find this, but too often I feel like many people expect scientists to be a one-stop shop. And we're not. We're just the very first, the people who diagnose the problem.
Well, I think so. I'm an engineer.
Yeah,
and so one of the issues that I often find is that look, the science may be clear, but boy, the scale of the problem is huge.
Yes.
And that's when the engineers come in. And once you start talking to engineers, things get really scary because things get big.
Yes, they do.
And they just get, okay, you want to do this? Right. This is how big it's going to be. And I think we're not ready for the bigness of it, really. The numbers are scary. So we've got another question here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I hear what you're saying in terms of getting people talking, but the conversation in the UK this year seems to have just been about fighting plastic. How much of that is a distraction and therefore a threat, or how much of it is an opportunity that we can jump upon and actually, well, that's nice about plastic, but let's take this further. What do you think?
That's a great question. I think the answer is yes and no. There's always the danger of saying, well, I don't use plastic straws anymore, so I've done my part, right? But then on the other hand, research also shows that once we feel like we've actually accomplished something, we feel empowered to continue to act. So it really is a delicate balance between, yes, that's great. We've managed to get rid of the straws. That is fantastic. But just as we've changed one part of our life, we recognize that there's many other things that we can change now. So we need to make that an empowering message rather than that you've done your part, now we're done. And that again is why the social science is so important. It really is fascinating. There's people who study these things, of how you can connect the positivity of having achieved a certain goal to then achieving more rather than stopping. So, yeah.
Another question here.
Yeah, I appreciate the positive message, as others have said, and focusing on solutions and painting a brighter future. And I agree that if we want to convince people to take action, scaring them just pushes them away, so that's probably not the most efficient method. At the same time, you showed the statistics that many people don't, or the minority believes it's going to affect us. So is it possible to convince people that, is it possible to achieve the ambitious climate goals that are necessary to avoid the apocalypse that's coming for all of us without convincing people that this apocalypse is coming?
Yes. I think that it is, so what I would characterize as the message that I try to communicate is rational hope. So not some type of fantasy of it's going to be all okay, because it really isn't going to be okay. There are some impacts that are inevitable. There are many much worse impacts that we can avoid if we act now. But connecting the dots between people's personal experiences, their values, and the impacts is key, but not leaving it there. Because too often we tell people what's going to happen, and then we just leave it there. And if somebody comes to us with a message of here's all the terrible things that our actions are doing, and we feel like there's nothing we can do about it, our defense mechanism is basically to just disassociate. I mean, if I feel like there's nothing I can really do about it, like microplastics, what am I supposed to do? Install filters? There aren't even filters to do. I'm just baffled by what I can do about that. And so I just kind of disassociate because I feel like I have no agency. So that's why it's so important to provide people with examples of what we can actually do personally as part of our organization, which could be school, business, industry, city, region, and then, most of all, to vote. Because as they say, what is it? You can change one person's mind, but changing a politician has a lot bigger impact. But bringing people to vote is, well, how would you get people to actually support something like that if they think it matters to them in the places where they live? So the impacts are a key part of the discussion, and I did not mean to undersell them at all. That's the work I work on myself. And what I do is, ever since the beginning when I've worked on climate impacts, we actually published one of the first impacts in the US for the state of California that documented specifically the differences between a higher and lower scenario. Up until then, most of the impact assessments just said basically here's kind of the range, and it usually focused on mid-range scenarios. So back in 2003, we specifically looked at a high scenario and a low scenario. Back then it was called A1FI and B1. And the A1FI was so unusual that only 2 climate models in the whole world had even run it at that time. One was the UK model. And then we went cap in hand to 2 US models, and we asked them to run it for us too. One of them said sure, the other said no, and then they called us 2 months later and said, pick up your data, we don't want a terabyte sitting on our server. So we got these 4 different climate models. That's all we had for the higher scenario, and then we had the lower scenario for California. We looked at impacts on wine grapes, because that's what they care about. We looked at impacts on air pollution, also a big issue. We looked at the impacts on snow cover in the mountains, because that supplies 50% of their water supply. We looked at the impacts on other specialty crops from the Central Valley, because that's where a lot of their economy comes from. We looked specifically at the difference between a higher and a lower scenario, and the difference was so stunning that it actually informed and empowered the first legislation in the United States to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And they quoted our study, and they said, because we can avoid these impacts, we are going to take action. So it can be empowering to show people the difference that our actions can make.
Katharine, I think we're going to have to wind up there, because you've got to get off to next door, the other place, dare I say. Here we are in Trinity, and there are other places. It has been wonderful today that you've taken the trouble to come and join us. The Cambridge Climate Lecture Series it's now its 3rd year. David Mackay, did you ever meet David Mackay?
I didn't.
He was a wonderful, numerate man, very passionate about sustainable energy, and I think he'd be very glad that you've come to speak to us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.